The night was a canvas of shadows, painted in hues of black and gray. The small town of Ravenswood lay silent, its streets empty, its people tucked away behind closed doors. But for Amy, this night would be anything but ordinary. Amy had always been a woman of logic and reason. At 27, she worked as a freelance journalist, chasing stories that others deemed too strange or dangerous to touch. Yet despite her adventurous spirit, nothing could have prepared her for the letter that arrived on her doorstep one rainy afternoon. The envelope was old, its edges frayed, and the handwriting on it was shaky but deliberate. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in elegant cursive. "Dear Miss Amy Carter, you are the sole inheritor of the property located at 13 Blackthorn Mountain. This house belonged to your late grandmother, Eleanor Carter. Please visit the estate at your earliest convenience to claim your inheritance. Enclosed is the key to the main entrance. Sincerely, Mr. Harold Finch, executor of the estate." Amy stared at the letter for a long time. She barely remembered her grandmother. Eleanor had been a recluse, living alone on the mountain, rarely visiting the family. Amy's parents had spoken little of her, and when they did, their voices carried a tone of unease. Now, out of the blue, Amy was being summoned to a place she'd never seen. That night, unable to sleep, Amy made up her mind. She would go to the house, not because she cared about the inheritance, but because something about the letter felt off. It wasn't just curiosity pulling her, it was a deep, inexplicable need to uncover the truth. The drive to Blackthorn Mountain was long and treacherous. The road wound through dense forests, where the trees seemed to lean inward, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. As Amy drove deeper into the wilderness, her phone lost signal, and the GPS screen blinked out. She was truly alone. By the time she reached the base of the mountain, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only the faint glow of her headlights to guide her. The air grew colder with every mile, and the silence was oppressive. Finally, she arrived at the iron gate mentioned in the letter. It loomed before her, rusted and foreboding, with vines creeping up its bars like veins. Amy stepped out of the car, her breath visible in the freezing air. She examined the gate, searching for a way to open it. There was no keypad, no intercom, just a heavy padlock hanging from the center. She pulled the key from her pocket and inserted it into the lock. To her surprise, it turned smoothly, as if the mechanism had been recently oiled. The gate creaked open with a sound that echoed through the forest, sending a flock of crows scattering into the night sky. Amy climbed back into her car and began the final ascent to the house. The road was steep and uneven, forcing her to drive slowly. Her headlights illuminated the path ahead, revealing glimpses of the towering mansion perched at the summit. When she finally reached the top, Amy parked her car and stepped out. The house stood before her like a specter from another time. Its stone walls were dark and weathered, and its windows were shattered or boarded up. A wrought iron balcony wrapped around the second floor, its railing twisted and broken in places. The front door was massive, carved from solid oak, with a brass knocker shaped like a wolf's head. Amy hesitated for a moment, then approached the door. She inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked, and the door swung open with a groan that sent shivers down her spine. The interior of the house was even more unsettling than its exterior. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, and the floorboards groaned under her weight as she stepped inside. Amy flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. Either the power was out, or the house had been abandoned for so long that the wiring had failed. She pulled out her flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the light like tiny stars. The furniture was covered in white sheets, giving the impression of ghostly figures frozen in time. In the center of the room stood a grand staircase, its banister carved with intricate designs of leaves and animals. As Amy explored further, she noticed something strange. On the far wall, there was a large portrait of a woman who bore a striking resemblance to her grandmother. But what caught her attention was the man standing beside her in the painting. He wore a black suit and held a cane, his expression cold and calculating. His eyes seemed to follow her as she moved, no matter where she stood in the room. "Who are you?" Amy whispered, though she knew no one would answer. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a soft creak, like footsteps on the floor above. Her heart raced. She was certain she was alone in the house. Was it the wind or something else? Gathering her courage, Amy decided to investigate. She climbed the staircase, each step groaning beneath her feet. At the top, she found a long hallway lined with doors. Most of them were closed, but one stood slightly ajar. A faint light flickered from within. Amy pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was unlike any other in the house. It was clean, almost pristine, with fresh candles burning on a wooden table. In the center of the table lay an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Beside it was a note written in the same shaky handwriting as the letter she'd received. If you found this, then you're ready to learn the truth. Read the journal carefully. It will explain everything. Amy picked up the journal and opened it. The first page read, Day 1. I have taken residence in this house at the request of my employer. He calls himself Mr. Blackthorn. Though he pays well, there is something about him that unnerves me. His presence fills the air with dread, and his eyes, they seem to see into my soul. Amy's hands trembled as she turned the page. What secrets did this house hold? And why had her grandmother left it to her? Amy sat on the edge of the bed in the candlelit room, her fingers trembling as she turned the fragile pages of the journal. The handwriting was neat but hurried, as if the author had been desperate to record their thoughts before something or someone stopped them. Day 7. Mr. Blackthorn has forbidden me from entering the west wing of the house. He says it is unsafe, that parts of it have collapsed. But I hear noises coming from there at night. Footsteps, whispers, and sometimes laughter. It is not the sound of ruin, it is the sound of life. Yet when I asked him about it, his expression turned cold, and he warned me never to mention it again. Amy paused, her eyes darting toward the door. The west wing. She hadn't explored it yet, but now her curiosity burned brighter than ever. What was hidden there, and why did Mr. Blackthorn want it kept secret? She continued reading. Day 14. I can no longer deny what I've suspected all along. This house is alive, not in the way a home feels warm or welcoming, but in a sinister, predatory sense. The walls seem to shift when no one is looking. The shadows grow longer than they should, and the mirrors, oh God, the mirrors, they reflect things that aren't there. Amy shivered. She glanced at the cracked mirror hanging on the wall across from her. For a moment, she thought she saw movement behind her reflection, a figure standing just out of view. She spun around, but the room was empty. Shaking off the unease, she returned to the journal. Day 21. Last night I saw her, a woman in white, walking through the halls. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She didn't speak, but she looked at me as if she wanted to warn me. When I followed her, she disappeared into the walls themselves. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. Something terrible is coming. The entry ended abruptly, the next page torn out violently. Amy flipped forward, searching for more clues, but the remaining entries were sparse and disjointed. One line stood out among the chaos. If you find this journal, leave immediately. Do not trust the house. Do not trust him. Before Amy could process the warning, the candles flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Her breath caught in her throat as the temperature dropped suddenly. She fumbled for her flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. Panic began to rise in her chest. Then she heard it, a low, guttural whisper right beside her ear. You shouldn't be here. Amy bolted upright, nearly dropping the journal. She stumbled toward the door, her heart pounding like a drum. As she reached the hallway, the lights flickered back on, revealing the long corridor bathed in an unnatural glow. Every door along the hall was now wide open, though she was certain they had been closed before. Something wasn't right. Determined to uncover the truth, Amy decided to investigate the West Wing despite the warnings in the journal. Armed with only her courage and a small pocket knife she carried for emergencies, she made her way down the staircase and through the main hall. The West Wing was separated from the rest of the house by a heavy wooden door, carved with intricate patterns of thorns and skulls. The handle was ice cold to the touch, and when Amy pushed it open, a wave of stale air hit her like a wall. The scent was overwhelming, dust, mildew, and something metallic, like blood. Inside, the floorboards were warped and splintered, making every step precarious. The walls were lined with faded tapestries depicting scenes of hunting and sacrifice. At the far end of the corridor, a single door stood ajar, emitting a faint red light. As Amy approached, she noticed strange symbols etched into the doorframe. They glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She hesitated, then pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything she'd seen before. It was circular, with blackened walls covered in more glowing symbols. In the center of the room was an altar made of stone, stained with dark streaks that looked suspiciously like dried blood. On the altar lay another journal, smaller and older than the first. Amy picked it up cautiously. The cover bore the name Eleanor Carter, her grandmother. Her hands shook as she opened it. "I came here seeking answers, but instead I found a curse. Mr. Blackthorne is not a man. He is something ancient, something evil. He feeds on fear and despair, and this house is his prison and his weapon. If anyone reads this, know that the only way to stop him is to destroy the source of his power. It lies beneath the house, in the catacombs. But beware, once you enter, there is no turning back." Suddenly, the ground beneath Amy's feet trembled. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, and a deep, resonant voice echoed through the room. "You dare trespass where you do not belong?" Amy spun around, but no one was there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She clutched the journal tightly and ran for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. Trapped in the cursed room, Amy realized she had two choices: face whatever lurked in the shadows, or try to find another way out. But as she searched for an escape, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was watching her and waiting. The room shook violently, and the glowing symbols on the walls began to pulse faster, casting eerie shadows that danced like living things. Amy pressed her back against the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The voice, deep, guttural, and filled with malice, spoke again. "You cannot escape your fate, little one. This house has chosen you." Amy's mind raced. She couldn't stay here. The oppressive energy in the room was suffocating. Her eyes darted around, searching for another way out. That's when she noticed a narrow crack in the wall behind the altar. It wasn't obvious at first glance, but upon closer inspection, she realized it was wide enough to squeeze through. With no other options, Amy grabbed the journal and shoved it into her bag. She pushed the altar aside, it was heavier than expected, and stepped toward the opening. The air coming from the crack was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. Taking a deep breath, she squeezed through the gap and found herself in a dimly lit passageway. The walls were made of rough stone, slick with moisture. Faint torches flickered sporadically along the corridor, their flames unnatural, blue instead of orange. The sound of dripping water echoed in the distance, mingling with something else, a low rhythmic chanting. Amy hesitated. The chanting was barely audible, but it sent chills down her spine. It sounded ancient, guttural, and utterly alien. She knew she should turn back, but the words in her grandmother's journal burned in her mind. The source of his power lies beneath the house. If she wanted answers, and a way to stop whatever lurked in this place, she had to keep going. The passage sloped downward, twisting and turning until Amy lost all sense of direction. The further she descended, the colder it became. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and her fingers tingled from the chill. The chanting grew louder, clearer now, though she still couldn't make out the words. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling stretched high above her, supported by jagged stone pillars carved with the same thorn and skull motifs she'd seen upstairs. At the center of the chamber stood a massive stone pedestal, atop which rested a black crystal, pulsating with an ominous red light. Around the pedestal, hooded figures knelt in a circle, their faces obscured by shadow. They swayed rhythmically, their voices rising and falling in unison. The air was thick with an almost tangible energy, pressing down on Amy like a weight. She crouched behind one of the pillars, her heart hammering in her chest. What were these people doing? Were they cultists, servants of Mr. Blackthorne? And what was the purpose of the crystal? As she watched, one of the figures rose and approached the pedestal. Their voice rang out, clear and commanding. "The vessel approaches. Prepare the offering." Amy froze. Had they spotted her? No, they were talking about someone else. But who? Before she could think further, the ground beneath her shifted slightly. A loose stone clattered to the floor, echoing loudly in the cavernous space. Every head turned in her direction. For a moment, there was silence. Then as one, the figures rose and began advancing toward her, their hoods concealing their faces, but not the menace radiating from them. Amy scrambled to her feet and bolted down a side tunnel, her footsteps echoing wildly. Behind her, the chanting resumed, louder and angrier this time. The walls seemed to close in around her, the torches flaring brighter as if urging her forward. She didn't know where she was running to, only that she had to get away. The tunnel eventually led to a dead end, a heavy iron gate blocking her path. Amy rattled the bars desperately, but it was locked tight. Turning around, she saw the hooded figures closing in, their movements unnervingly synchronized. There was nowhere to go. One of the figures stepped forward, lowering their hood. To Amy's shock, it wasn't a person at all. It was a creature, its skin gray and cracked like old bark, its eyes glowing with the same red light as the crystal. Its lips curled into a grotesque smile. "You should not have come here," it hissed, its voice layered with echoes. "But since you have, you will serve." Amy backed against the gate, clutching her pocket knife. She knew it wouldn't do much against such a thing, but she refused to go down without a fight. Just as the creature lunged at her, a deafening roar shook the catacombs. The ground split open, sending chunks of rock tumbling into a fiery abyss below. From the depths emerged a figure cloaked in darkness, its presence so overwhelming that even the creatures recoiled. Amy stared in horror as the figure turned its gaze toward her. Though she couldn't see its face, she felt its piercing stare bore into her soul. "So," it said, its voice smooth yet chilling, "you are Eleanor's granddaughter." It was Mr. Blackthorne. Mr. Blackthorne stepped closer, his form shifting unnervingly between shadow and substance. His presence filled the cavern, suffocating the air around Amy. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, but she forced herself to stand tall, gripping her pocket knife tightly despite knowing how futile it would be against him. "You've caused quite a disturbance," he said, his voice smooth and melodic, yet laced with menace. "Few have ventured this far into my domain and lived to tell the tale." Amy swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. Blackthorne tilted his head, studying her as if she were an insect under glass. "Want? Oh, child, I don't want anything. You're here because the house chose you. It senses something in you, something your grandmother tried to suppress." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Eleanor was stubborn, just like you, but even she couldn't resist forever." Amy's mind raced. Her grandmother had left clues in the journal about destroying the source of his power. Was that why the house had called her here? To finish what Eleanor started? "And what happens if I refuse to play along?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Blackthorne chuckled, a sound that reverberated through the chamber like distant thunder. "Refusal isn't an option, my dear. You see, this house feeds on fear, despair, and sacrifice. Without fresh souls to sustain it, its power wanes. And I cannot allow that." He gestured toward the black crystal pulsating at the center of the room. "That is the heart of the house and my connection to this world. Destroy it, and you destroy me. But know this, attempting such a thing will unleash horrors beyond comprehension." Amy clenched her jaw. She didn't trust him, not for a second, but his words hinted at a truth she couldn't ignore. If the crystal truly was the source of his power, then it had to be destroyed. But how? Before she could respond, one of the hooded figures lunged at her, claws extended. Amy ducked, slashing wildly with her knife. The blade grazed the creature's arm, causing it to hiss in pain. Before it could retaliate, a deafening screech echoed through the chamber, shaking the very foundations of the catacombs. A blinding light erupted from somewhere behind Amy, forcing everyone, including Blackthorne, to shield their eyes. When the light faded, a figure stood between Amy and her attackers. It was a woman dressed in flowing white robes, her face pale and ethereal. Her hollow eyes locked onto Blackthorne, and her voice rang out like a bell tolling doom. "Enough," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. The creatures recoiled, hissing and retreating into the shadows. Even Blackthorn seemed taken aback, though he quickly masked his surprise with a sneer. "You dare interfere, spirit?" He spat, his calm demeanor cracking slightly. "You're nothing but a remnant of the past, a failed experiment." The woman ignored him, turning instead to Amy. "Come with me," she whispered, extending a translucent hand. "There isn't much time." Amy hesitated. This woman, this apparition, was clearly not human. Yet there was something familiar about her, something comforting. "Who are you?" Amy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am Lila," the woman replied, "your grandmother's sister, and the last person who tried to stop him." Amy's eyes widened. Her grandmother had never mentioned having a sister. But before she could ask more questions, Lila grabbed her wrist and pulled her into the shadows. The walls shimmered and twisted, and suddenly they were no longer in the catacombs. They stood in a small, dimly lit room filled with relics, old books, jars containing strange objects, and maps marked with cryptic symbols. In the center of the room was a table covered in dust, upon which lay another journal, this one bound in crimson leather. "This is my sanctuary," Lila explained, "a place hidden from his sight. Here we can plan your next move." "But why are you helping me?" Amy asked, still wary. Lila's expression softened. "Because I failed once. Because Eleanor sacrificed everything to protect you. And because if you don't succeed, this nightmare will never end." She handed Amy the crimson journal. "Everything you need to know is in here. But beware. The path ahead is fraught with danger. Trust no one, not even those who claim to help you. Not all allies are what they seem." As Amy opened the journal, the pages began to glow faintly, revealing instructions written in golden ink. At the top of the first page were 3 words: "Break the cycle." Over the next hour, Amy pored over the journal, absorbing every detail. According to Lila, the only way to destroy the crystal, and thus sever Blackthorn's hold on the house, was to perform a ritual during the next lunar eclipse. The problem? The eclipse was only 3 days away, and the ritual required rare ingredients scattered throughout the house. Worse still, Blackthorn already knew Amy was planning something. As they spoke, the temperature in the hidden room dropped sharply, and the air grew heavy with malice. "He's coming," Lila warned, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You must leave now. Gather the items quickly and return here when the time is right. I'll hold him off as long as I can." Before Amy could protest, Lila pushed her toward a narrow passageway. "Go," she urged, "and remember, the house will try to deceive you. Stay true to yourself, or it will consume you." Amy ran, clutching the journal tightly. Behind her, she heard a blood-curdling scream as Lila confronted Blackthorn. Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced herself to keep moving. There was no time to grieve. Amy emerged from the hidden passageway into a part of the house she hadn't explored yet. A long-abandoned library. Dust coated every surface, and the shelves sagged under the weight of ancient tomes. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. But there was something else, an almost imperceptible hum, like the house itself was alive and watching. She opened the crimson journal again, flipping to the list of ingredients. The first item was marked clearly, a shard of moonlight trapped in glass. Beneath it was a cryptic note: "Seek the mirror room. Beware its reflections." Amy frowned. The mirror room? She had no idea where that was, but she suspected the house would guide her, whether she wanted it to or not. As if on cue, the lights flickered, and a faint glow emanated from a door at the far end of the library. It swung open slowly, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling upward. Without hesitation, Amy climbed the steps, her footsteps echoing ominously. At the top, she found herself in a circular chamber lined with mirrors. Each mirror reflected not only her image, but also distorted versions of herself. Some smiling wickedly, others crying silently, and some staring back with cold, lifeless eyes. In the center of the room stood a pedestal holding a small glass vial. Inside, a sliver of silvery light shimmered faintly, a shard of moonlight, just as the journal described. But as Amy approached, the mirrors began to shift. Her reflections stepped out of their frames, becoming solid figures that surrounded her. They weren't duplicates. They were twisted versions of herself, each embodying a fear or regret she'd buried deep within. One reflection sneered at her. "You'll never be strong enough," it taunted, its voice dripping with venom. Another whispered softly, tears streaming down its face. "You're going to fail just like everyone else." The final reflection simply stared, its eyes hollow and accusing. "Why did you come here? You've doomed us all." Amy clenched her fists, fighting back the rising panic. She remembered Lila's warning, "Stay true to yourself." These weren't real. They were illusions meant to break her spirit. Summoning every ounce of courage, Amy turned away from the reflections and reached for the vial. As soon as her fingers closed around it, the reflection shattered into shards of glass, raining down around her. The mirrors themselves cracked and darkened, leaving the room eerily silent. Breathing heavily, Amy tucked the vial into her bag. One ingredient down, two to go. The journal listed the second ingredient next, a drop of blood willingly given by one who has faced death. This one puzzled Amy. Who could possibly fit that description? And how was she supposed to find them in this cursed house? Before she could dwell on it, the floor beneath her feet trembled. A low growl echoed through the walls, followed by a chilling whisper. "Come to me." Against her better judgment, Amy followed the sound. It led her to the attic, a cramped, shadowy space filled with broken furniture and cobwebs. In the corner, chained to the wall, was a man. His clothes were tattered, his face gaunt, but his eyes burned with intensity. "Who are you?" Amy asked cautiously, keeping her distance. "My name is Daniel," he rasped. "I was sent here years ago to investigate the disappearances in this town. I didn't realize what I was walking into until it was too late." Amy's heart sank. This man had been trapped here, enduring horrors she couldn't imagine. But before she could offer help, he spoke again. "You need my blood, don't you?" he said, his voice steady despite his weakened state. "Take it. If it means ending this nightmare, I'll gladly give it." Amy hesitated. Was this another trick of the house? Or was Daniel truly willing to sacrifice himself? "I won't force you," she said finally. "It has to be your choice." Daniel nodded grimly. "Then do it, before he comes for us both." With trembling hands, Amy used her pocket knife to carefully draw a single drop of blood onto a piece of cloth. As soon as she did, the chains binding Daniel dissolved into mist, and he collapsed to the floor unconscious. She didn't have time to tend to him. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent. Blackthorn knew she was close. The last ingredient was the most daunting, a tear shed in pure sorrow. Amy stared at the entry, her stomach sinking. How was she supposed to produce such a thing? Sorrow wasn't something she could summon on command. The journal offered a clue. Return to the place where your journey began. Reluctantly, Amy retraced her steps to the room where she'd first discovered the glowing journal. The room with the fresh candles and pristine furnishings. But when she entered, the atmosphere had changed. The candles were extinguished, and the air was icy cold. In the center of the room stood a figure, her grandmother, Eleanor. Amy gasped, tears springing to her eyes. "Grandma?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "Hello, my dear. I've waited so long for you to come." "But how are you here?" Amy stammered. "This is a memory," Eleanor replied gently. "The house allows me to appear briefly to guide you. But listen carefully, Amy. To obtain the final ingredient, you must confront the pain you've carried all these years. The loss of your parents, the loneliness, the guilt. Only then will your sorrow be pure." Amy felt a lump rise in her throat. She thought she'd buried those feelings long ago, but now they surged forward, overwhelming her. Tears streamed down her face as memories flooded her mind. Her mother's laughter, her father's embrace, the emptiness after they were gone. When the tears finally subsided, a single droplet hovered in the air before falling into a small vial that materialized in Amy's hand. The final ingredient was hers. With all three ingredients secured, Amy retraced her steps toward Lila's hidden sanctuary. But the house was no longer passive. It had become an active adversary, twisting its halls and filling them with horrors designed to break her resolve. The walls seemed to pulse like living veins, and shadows writhed across the floor, forming grotesque shapes that lunged at her before dissipating into nothingness. Whispers echoed in her ears, each voice taunting her with fragments of her past. You're not strong enough. Everyone you love will suffer because of you. Give up. It's already too late. Amy pressed forward, clutching the journal tightly. She repeated Lila's words like a mantra. Stay true to yourself. The house wanted her to doubt, to falter, but she refused to let it win. As she neared the hidden passageway leading to Layla's sanctuary, the ground beneath her feet trembled violently. A deafening roar shook the foundations of the house, and a wave of black smoke surged through the corridor, coalescing into the form of Mr. Blackthorn. You've grown bold, little one, he sneered, his crimson eyes glowing with malice. But bravery won't save you now. Before Amy could react, tendrils of shadow erupted from the walls, wrapping around her arms and legs. She struggled, but the grip was unyielding. Blackthorn stepped closer, his hand reaching for the bag containing the ingredients. Just as his fingers brushed the fabric, a blinding flash of light erupted from the journal. The golden ink on its pages flared brightly, forcing Blackthorn to recoil. The shadows binding Amy dissipated, and she stumbled backward, clutching the bag to her chest. Don't underestimate me, she spat, her voice trembling but defiant. Blackthorn snarled, his form flickering between man and monster. Very well. If you wish to play games, so be it. Let's see how long you last. With that, he vanished into the smoke, leaving behind an ominous silence. Amy finally reached Lila's sanctuary, only to find the ghostly woman waiting anxiously. Her translucent form flickered weakly, as if holding Blackthorn off had drained much of her energy. He knows what you're planning, Lila said urgently. The house will do everything in its power to stop you. You must perform the ritual quickly and perfectly, or we'll all be lost. Amy nodded, pulling out the ingredients. Together, they spread the items on the table. The shard of moonlight, the drop of Daniel's blood, and the vial containing her tear of sorrow. Lila opened the crimson journal to the page detailing the ritual and began explaining the steps. The crystal is tied to the house's essence, Lila said. To destroy it, you must channel your willpower into the ingredients during the eclipse. When the moon fully covers the sun, recite the incantation written here. She pointed to a series of runes etched into the journal's final page. But beware, she added gravely. Blackthorn will try to corrupt the ritual. He may even take on a form you trust. Do not falter. Trust only your instincts. Amy memorized the runes, tracing their shapes with her finger. They felt warm to the touch, as if imbued with ancient power. Once she was ready, Lila led her back to the catacombs, guiding her through secret passages to avoid detection. When they reached the catacombs, the atmosphere was suffocating. The black crystal pulsed erratically, its red light casting jagged shadows across the chamber. The hooded figures knelt in silence, their heads bowed as if awaiting orders. Above, the sky darkened as the lunar eclipse began. Lila turned to Amy, her expression solemn. This is it. I'll hold them off as long as I can. Focus on the ritual, and remember, no matter what happens, don't look away from the crystal. With that, Lila stepped forward, raising her arms. A surge of ethereal energy erupted from her, driving the hooded figures back. Their guttural screams filled the air as they scrambled to regroup. Amy approached the pedestal, placing the ingredients carefully around the crystal. She closed her eyes, focusing on the runes and the rhythm of her breathing. As the moon slid further over the sun, the temperature plummeted, and the air crackled with electricity. Suddenly, a familiar voice whispered behind her. Amy! Her heart skipped a beat. That voice, it belonged to her mother. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned her head. There, standing just beyond the pedestal, was her mother. She looked exactly as Amy remembered her. Kind eyes, warm smile, arms open wide. Come to me, sweetheart, her mother said softly. It's okay. You've done enough. Tears blurred Amy's vision. For a moment, she forgot where she was, forgot the ritual, forgot everything except the longing to embrace her mother once more. But then she caught sight of the journal lying on the pedestal. Its golden ink glowed faintly, reminding her of Lila's warning. Trust only your instincts. Her mother's image wavered, her smile twisting into a cruel smirk. So stubborn, the voice hissed, now unmistakably Blackthorn's. Even now you resist. Amy clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. You're not real, she whispered, turning back to the crystal. None of this is real. The illusion shattered, leaving only the oppressive darkness of the catacombs. The eclipse was nearing its peak. It was time. Amy began the incantation, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. The runes glowed brighter with each word, their light piercing the shadows. The crystal shuddered, resisting the ritual's power. Blackthorn materialized before her, his form shifting wildly between human and monstrous. His eyes burned with fury as he unleashed torrents of shadowy energy, trying to disrupt the ritual. You think you can defeat me? He roared. I am eternal. This house is my prison and my throne. Amy ignored him, pouring every ounce of her willpower into the chant. The ingredients responded, glowing in unison as their energies merged. The crystal cracked, sending shockwaves through the chamber. Lila appeared beside Amy, her form flickering rapidly. Keep going, she urged. Don't stop now. With a final surge of determination, Amy completed the incantation. The crystal exploded in a burst of blinding light, disintegrating into ash. The house trembled violently, its walls collapsing inward as centuries of accumulated malevolence were purged. Blackthorn screamed, a sound of pure rage and despair, as his form dissolved into nothingness. The hooded figures crumbled to dust, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The explosion of light from the crystal sent shockwaves rippling through the catacombs, destabilizing the very foundation of the house. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and cracks spiderwebbed across the walls. The air was thick with the scent of burnt earth and ozone, a stark reminder of the power that had just been unleashed. Amy staggered to her feet, her body trembling from exhaustion. Her voice was raw from chanting, and her hands were blistered from gripping the glowing journal. Lila stood beside her, her translucent form flickering like a dying flame. It's done, Lila whispered, her voice tinged with both relief and sorrow. But we must leave now. The house won't survive much longer. Before Amy could respond, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. A deep rumble echoed through the chamber as chunks of rock tumbled from above, narrowly missing them. Without hesitation, Amy grabbed the journal and followed Lila into the chaos. The passageways were collapsing around them, forcing Amy to navigate blindly through clouds of dust and debris. The once familiar halls twisted and shifted, as if the house was trying one last desperate attempt to trap her within its ruins. Lila led the way, her ghostly form guiding Amy through hidden paths only she could see. At times, Amy thought she heard whispers, faint remnants of Blackthorn's influence, but they faded into nothingness as the house continued to crumble. Finally, they reached the main staircase. The grand foyer below was in shambles, with parts of the ceiling caving in and furniture reduced to splinters. Through the shattered front doors, Amy could see the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the trees outside. But as she stepped toward freedom, a figure emerged from the shadows. Daniel, the man she'd freed from the attic. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, but he managed a weak smile. You did it, he said hoarsely. You broke the curse. Amy nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to thank him, to ask how he'd survived the collapse, but there was no time. The house groaned ominously, and the floor beneath them began to give way. Go, Lila urged, pushing Amy toward the exit. I'll stay behind to ensure the house doesn't follow you. No, Amy cried, reaching out for the ghostly woman. You've done enough. Come with us. Lila shook her head, her expression soft but resolute. This is my penance, Amy. My failure allowed Blackthorn to thrive for so long. Now it's time for me to make amends. Before Amy could protest further, Lila vanished into the swirling dust, her final words echoing in Amy's mind. Remember who you are, and never let fear define you. With Daniel's help, Amy stumbled out of the house just as the structure collapsed inward with a deafening roar. The ground shook beneath their feet, and a plume of smoke rose into the night sky, marking the end of Blackthorn's reign. Exhausted and battered, Amy sank to her knees on the damp grass. staring at the smoldering ruins of the house. Daniel sat beside her, his breathing labored but steady. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply watched as the embers died out, leaving behind only silence. Eventually, Daniel broke the quiet. "Your grandmother, Eleanor, she saved me when I first came here. She hid me in the attic, knowing I wouldn't survive otherwise. But even she couldn't stop him completely." Amy turned to him, her brow furrowed. "Why didn't she tell anyone? Why keep all of this a secret?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Because the truth would have destroyed your family. Blackthorn wasn't just some random evil. He was tied to your bloodline. Your great-grandfather made a deal with him decades ago, trading power for immortality. That's why the house chose you, Amy. It recognized the bond." Amy felt as though the wind had been knocked out of her. All this time she'd believed the house was merely cursed, but now she understood. It wasn't just a prison for Blackthorn, it was a legacy of betrayal and greed passed down through generations. "And my parents?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did they know?" Daniel nodded grimly. "They suspected. That's why they moved away from Ravenswood, to protect you. But even distance, it couldn't shield them entirely. Blackthorn's reach is vast." Tears streamed down Amy's face as the weight of his words settled over her. Her parents' deaths hadn't been an accident. They had been sacrifices, collateral damage in a centuries-old war between good and evil. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Amy knew she couldn't stay in Ravenswood any longer. The town held too many memories, too many ghosts, but she also knew she couldn't forget what had happened here, or the lessons she'd learned. She packed what little belongings she'd brought and loaded them into her car. Daniel offered to drive her back to civilization, insisting that he owed her his life. Though reluctant to impose, Amy accepted his help, grateful for the company. Before leaving, she paused at the edge of the property, looking back at the charred remains of the house. Despite everything, she felt a strange sense of closure. The house had taken so much from her, but it had also given her something invaluable: strength. "I'll honor their memory," she whispered, clutching the crimson journal tightly, "and I'll make sure no one else suffers because of our family's mistakes." Weeks passed since Amy left Ravenswood, but the memories of the cursed house haunted her dreams. She tried to resume her normal life, writing articles, meeting deadlines, and avoiding anything remotely connected to the supernatural. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. It started subtly, a shadow darting across the corner of her vision, a faint whisper when no one else was around, or the sensation of being followed on quiet streets. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, a side effect of everything she'd endured. But then the signs became harder to ignore. One night, as she sat at her desk reviewing notes for an article, the crimson journal slipped from her bag and fell open. The golden runes shimmered faintly, glowing brighter with each passing second. Amy froze, her heart pounding. She hadn't touched the journal since leaving the house. It shouldn't have been reacting like this. Before she could close it, the words on the page rearranged themselves, forming a single sentence: "He is not gone." Amy slammed the journal shut, her hands trembling. Was Blackthorn still alive? Had the ritual failed? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who would visit at this hour? Cautiously, she approached the door and peered through the peephole. To her relief, it was Daniel. His face was pale, his expression grim. She opened the door. "What are you doing here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Something's wrong." Daniel explained that shortly after parting ways with Amy, he began investigating reports of strange occurrences in nearby towns. People claimed to see shadowy figures stalking them, hear disembodied voices, and experience inexplicable cold spots. When he dug deeper, he discovered a pattern. All the incidents traced back to locations linked to Blackthorn's influence. "I think fragments of him survived the ritual," Daniel admitted. "The crystal may have been destroyed, but his essence, it's like smoke. Hard to contain, harder to extinguish." Amy felt a chill run down her spine. "So what does that mean? Is he coming back?" Daniel hesitated before answering. Not entirely, but enough of him remains to cause trouble. And if we don't stop it now, those fragments will grow stronger. Eventually, they'll find a new host. Amy sank onto the couch, clutching the journal tightly. Why me? Why can't I just walk away? Because you're tied to him now, Daniel said gently. Your bloodline made you a target, and defeating him marked you as something more, a threat. If you leave this alone, he'll come for you again. And next time, you might not survive. Amy stared at him, torn between fear and determination. She had fought so hard to escape the darkness, but maybe running wasn't the answer. Maybe she needed to confront it head on. What do I need to do? She asked finally. Weeks passed since Amy left Ravenswood, but the memories of the cursed house haunted her dreams. She tried to resume her normal life, writing articles, meeting deadlines, and avoiding anything remotely connected to the supernatural. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. It started subtly, a shadow darting across the corner of her vision, a faint whisper when no one else was around, or the sensation of being followed on quiet streets. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, a side effect of everything she'd endured. But then the signs became harder to ignore. One night, as she sat at her desk reviewing notes for an article, the crimson journal slipped from her bag and fell open. The golden runes shimmered faintly, glowing brighter with each passing second. Amy froze, her heart pounding. She hadn't touched the journal since leaving the house. It shouldn't have been reacting like this. Before she could close it, the words on the page rearranged themselves, forming a single sentence. He is not gone. Amy slammed the journal shut, her hands trembling. Was Blackthorn still alive? Had the ritual failed? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who would visit at this hour? Cautiously, she approached the door and peered through the peephole. To her relief, it was Daniel. His face was pale, his expression grim. She opened the door. "What are you doing here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Something's wrong." Daniel explained that shortly after parting ways with Amy, he began investigating reports of strange occurrences in nearby towns. People claimed to see shadowy figures stalking them, hear disembodied voices, and experience inexplicable cold spots. When he dug deeper, he discovered a pattern. All the incidents traced back to locations linked to Blackthorn's influence. "I think fragments of him survived the ritual," Daniel admitted. "The crystal may have been destroyed, but his essence, it's like smoke. Hard to contain, harder to extinguish." Amy felt a chill run down her spine. "So what does that mean? Is he coming back?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Not entirely, but enough of him remains to cause trouble. And if we don't stop it now, those fragments will grow stronger. Eventually, they'll find a new host." Amy sank onto the couch, clutching the journal tightly. Why me? Why can't I just walk away? Because you're tied to him now, Daniel said gently. Your bloodline made you a target, and defeating him marked you as something more, a threat. If you leave this alone, he'll come for you again. And next time, you might not survive. Amy stared at him, torn between fear and determination. She had fought so hard to escape the darkness, but maybe running wasn't the answer. Maybe she needed to confront it head on. What do I need to do? She asked finally. After days of deliberation, Amy made her decision. She couldn't turn her back on the responsibility thrust upon her. If there was even a chance that Blackthorn, or fragments of him, still existed, she owed it to herself and others to finish what she started. Her first mission came sooner than expected. Reports surfaced of a young girl in a neighboring town who claimed to see a man in black lurking outside her window every night. The descriptions matched Blackthorn's appearance perfectly. Accompanied by Daniel, Amy traveled to the town and met with the girl's family. They were terrified, unsure whether to believe their daughter's claims or dismiss them as childish imagination. But when Amy examined the girl's room, she found faint traces of shadow magic etched into the walls. Residual energy left behind by Blackthorn's essence. This isn't paranoia, Amy told the parents. Your daughter's telling the truth. Using knowledge gleaned from the Crimson Journal and Daniel's guidance, Amy performed a cleansing ritual to banish the lingering presence. As she chanted the incantation, the shadows dissipated and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The girl smiled for the first time in weeks, free from the weight of unseen eyes. With her first mission behind her, Amy began training under Daniel and other members of the Veil Keepers. They taught her how to identify supernatural energy, perform protective rituals, and defend herself against malevolent forces. It was overwhelming at times, but Amy threw herself into the work with a determination born of necessity. She couldn't afford to be weak, not when lives depended on her. One evening during a briefing at the Veil Keepers' headquarters, a hidden compound filled with ancient artifacts and cryptic maps, Daniel introduced Amy to an older member of the group, Dr. Elias Kane, a historian specializing in occult phenomena. Blackthorn wasn't unique, Elias explained, his voice grave. He was part of something much larger, an ancient order known as the Obsidian Circle. These beings thrived on fear, despair, and chaos, feeding off humanity's darkest emotions. Amy frowned. So there are others like him? Elias nodded. Yes, and if fragments of Blackthorn still exist, they could act as conduits for these other entities. We need to find them before they grow strong enough to manifest fully. He handed her a thick dossier containing information about the Obsidian Circle. Among the pages were sketches of grotesque figures, accounts of historical disasters linked to their influence, and warnings written in multiple languages. This is your next mission, Elias said. We've detected unusual activity in a small coastal town called Seabrook. Locals report strange weather patterns, unexplained disappearances, and sightings of shadowy figures near the cliffs. Something is stirring there. Seabrook was unlike any place Amy had ever visited. The town clung to the edge of a jagged coastline, battered by relentless winds and crashing waves. Its streets were eerily quiet, and the few residents who ventured outside avoided eye contact, their faces pale and drawn. Amy and Daniel checked into a rundown inn overlooking the ocean. From their room, they could see the cliffs that loomed over the water, shrouded in mist. According to local legends, the cliffs were cursed, a claim dismissed by skeptics but taken seriously by those who lived there. That night, Amy stood by the window, staring out at the restless sea. She felt a strange pull, as though the ocean itself was calling to her. Shaking off the feeling, she turned back to the dossier Elias had given her. One name stood out among the documents, Moros, a being associated with hopelessness and ruin. "Do you think this is connected to Moros?" she asked Daniel, who sat cross-legged on the bed reviewing notes. "It's possible," he replied. "If Blackthorn's essence lingers here, it might have attracted Moros, or worse, awakened him." Before they could discuss further, a loud crash echoed from outside. Rushing to the window, they saw a figure stumbling along the cliffside, a young man drenched and clearly disoriented. He collapsed just as Amy and Daniel ran out to help. The young man introduced himself as Caleb. He claimed to be a fisherman who had been lost at sea for days after a sudden storm capsized his boat. But his story didn't add up. His clothes weren't wet, and his eyes darted nervously, as if he were hiding something. Back at the inn, Amy pressed him for details. Finally, Caleb broke down, confessing that he hadn't been alone on the boat. Two of his crewmates had vanished without a trace during the storm, and the last thing he remembered before washing ashore was seeing a massive shadow rising from the depths. "A shadow?" Amy repeated, exchanging a glance with Daniel. Caleb nodded, trembling. It spoke to me, told me I'd never escape." Amy knew then that whatever was happening in Seabrook went beyond natural explanations. Gathering her supplies, she decided to investigate the cliffs where Caleb had washed ashore. Daniel insisted on coming with her, citing safety concerns. The cliffs were treacherous, slick with seawater and moss. As Amy and Daniel climbed down toward the shore, they noticed strange symbols carved into the rock face, similar to those etched into the walls of Blackthorn's catacombs. The air grew colder the closer they got to the base, and the sound of the waves seemed distorted, almost unnatural. At the bottom, they discovered a narrow cave partially submerged by the tide. Inside, the walls glowed faintly with phosphorescent algae, illuminating a series of carvings depicting humanoid figures, bowing before a towering serpentine entity. "This must be Moros," Amy whispered, tracing one of the carvings with her fingers. The image sent a chill through her. It radiated despair so strongly she could feel it in her bones. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. Water surged into the cave, forcing them to retreat. As they scrambled back toward the entrance, a deep, guttural voice echoed around them. "You dare disturb my slumber?" A massive shadow emerged from the depths, its form shifting between liquid and solid. Eyes like burning coals locked onto Amy, and she realized with dread that this was no ordinary spirit. It was Moros himself. Moros lunged at them, his body stretching unnaturally as he tried to engulf them in darkness. Amy reacted instinctively, pulling out the crimson journal and reciting a protective incantation. A barrier of golden light flared to life, holding the entity at bay, but only temporarily. "We can't fight him here," Daniel shouted over the roar of the waves. "We need to weaken him first." Amy nodded, focusing on the carvings. She remembered what Elias had said. These entities fed on negative emotions. To defeat Moros, she needed to counteract his influence with hope and resilience. Summoning every ounce of courage, Amy stepped forward, meeting Moros's gaze. "You won't win," she declared, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "I've faced worse than you, and I'm still standing." Her words seemed to falter Moros, his form flickering uncertainly. Seizing the opportunity, Daniel hurled a vial of salt water infused with protective herbs at the entity. The concoction sizzled upon contact, forcing Moros to retreat deeper into the cave. As the tide receded, taking Moros with it, Amy collapsed onto the rocky shore, exhausted but alive. For now, the threat had been contained, but she knew it wouldn't stay buried forever. Back at the Veilkeeper's headquarters, Amy recounted the events in Seabrook to Elias and the other members. While some praised her quick thinking and bravery, others were less enthusiastic. One member in particular, a stern woman named Margot, spoke up during the debriefing. "She acted recklessly," Margot said, her tone sharp. "Moros is one of the most dangerous entities we've encountered. Sending someone so inexperienced into that situation was a mistake." Amy bristled but held her tongue. She knew Margot had a point. She was inexperienced. But she also couldn't deny the results. She'd managed to drive Moros back, even if only temporarily. Daniel stepped in to defend her. "Amy's instincts saved us out there. Without her, we wouldn't have stood a chance against him." Margot crossed her arms, unconvinced. "Instincts aren't enough. If she wants to stay involved, she needs proper training and supervision." The room fell silent, the weight of Margot's words hanging heavily in the air. Amy felt a mix of frustration and shame. She wanted to prove herself, but deep down, she wondered if they were right. Was she truly ready for this? Elias broke the tension. "Regardless of opinions, Amy has shown remarkable potential. We'll assign her to smaller missions while she continues her training. In the meantime, we need to focus on what Moros revealed about the Obsidian Circle." He turned to Amy. "Did you notice anything unusual during your confrontation? Any details that might help us understand their connection to Blackthorn?" Amy hesitated, recalling the shifting symbols in the cave and the overwhelming sense of despair Moros exuded. Then something clicked, a memory from her dreamlike visions during the battle. "They're connected through rituals," she said slowly. "Blackthorn mentioned the Pact before he was destroyed. I think it's how they anchor themselves to our world." Elias nodded thoughtfully. "A ritual binding multiple entities together. That would explain why fragments of Blackthorn survived. If we can locate the source of these pacts, we might be able to sever their ties permanently." That night, Amy's dreams took her back to Blackthorn's origins. She found herself standing in a dark chamber, lit by torches, surrounded by hooded figures, chanting in an ancient tongue. At the center of the room stood a man who bore a striking resemblance to her great-grandfather, or at least the portrait she'd seen in the cursed house. The man knelt before a towering obsidian altar, his hands trembling as he placed a blood-stained dagger upon its surface. From the shadows emerged a figure cloaked in darkness, Blackthorn. His voice echoed through the chamber. "You seek immortality, mortal? Very well, but know this. Such power comes at a cost. Your bloodline will bear the burden of my existence." The scene shifted abruptly. Amy saw generations of her family bound by chains of shadow, their faces etched with anguish. Each generation had tried and failed to break free from Blackthorn's influence. Finally, the vision settled on her grandmother, Eleanor, standing defiantly before the same altar. "I will end this," Eleanor vowed, her voice filled with resolve. "No more sacrifices, no more suffering." The dream ended with a blinding flash of light, leaving Amy gasping awake in her bed. Her heart raced as fragments of the vision replayed in her mind. It wasn't just a dream, it was a message, a glimpse into the truth behind her family's curse. The next morning, Amy shared her dream with Daniel and Elias. Both listened intently, their expressions growing increasingly grave. "It confirms what we suspected," Elias said. "The pact binds not only Blackthorn, but all members of the Obsidian Circle to your bloodline. Breaking it won't be easy. It requires undoing centuries of magic." "But it's possible, right?" Amy asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "If we destroy the source of the pact, we can stop them for good." Elias hesitated before answering. "In theory, yes. But locating the source won't be straightforward. It's likely hidden in a place tied to the original ritual, a nexus of dark energy." Daniel leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What about Ravenswood? The house was built on top of those catacombs. Could the source be there?" Elias shook his head. "Doubtful. The house was merely a prison for Blackthorn. The true nexus would be somewhere older, more sacred." Amy frowned. "Then where do we start looking?" Before anyone could answer, alarms blared throughout the compound. A red light flashed overhead, signaling an emergency. Moments later, a young keeper burst into the room, breathless. "We've detected a surge of supernatural activity in Chicago," he reported. "Reports of mass hysteria, violent outbreaks, and sightings of shadowy figures. Whatever's causing it is spreading fast." Elias exchanged a glance with Daniel. "It's Moros. He's grown stronger." Chicago was chaos. Streets were deserted except for panicked citizens running for shelter, their faces pale with terror. Buildings loomed ominously, their windows reflecting distorted images of the people below. The air was thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. Amy and Daniel arrived at the epicenter of the disturbance, an abandoned theater in the heart of downtown. Inside, the walls were covered in fresh carvings identical to those in Seabrook. The symbols pulsed faintly, feeding off the fear radiating from the city. "This is his anchor point," Amy realized, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's using the theater to amplify his influence." As they ventured deeper into the building, they encountered victims of Moros's power, people frozen in states of abject despair, their eyes vacant and their bodies unmoving. Among them was a young girl clutching a stuffed rabbit, tears streaming silently down her face. Amy knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to fix this," she promised, though she wasn't sure if the girl could hear her. Suddenly, the ground trembled and the lights flickered. From the shadows emerged Moros, his form larger and more menacing than before. His voice boomed through the theater. "You cannot save them. They are mine." Amy refused to back down. Drawing strength from the Crimson Journal and the lessons she'd learned, she confronted Moros head-on. This time, she didn't rely solely on incantations or protective barriers. Instead, she focused on channeling hope. A force she discovered was just as powerful as despair. "You feed on fear," she shouted, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "But fear isn't all humanity has to offer. We're stronger than you think." With Daniel's help, she performed a ritual designed to counteract Moros's influence. Golden light erupted from the journal, engulfing the theater and driving the entity back into the shadows. The carvings on the walls crumbled to dust, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Though weakened, Moros wasn't destroyed. As he retreated, his voice echoed one final warning. "This isn't over." The circle remains unbroken. Back at the Veil Keeper's headquarters, Amy pored over ancient texts and maps, searching for any clue that might lead them to the ritual's nexus, the source of the pact binding the Obsidian Circle to her bloodline. Her mind kept returning to the vision of her grandmother, Eleanor, standing defiantly before the obsidian altar. What had Eleanor done to try and end the curse? And why hadn't she succeeded? Elias joined her in the library, his expression grim. "We've been studying your family history," he began, placing a stack of documents on the table. Your grandmother wasn't just fighting Blackthorn, she was trying to dismantle the entire circle. Amy frowned. What do you mean? Elias hesitated before answering. Eleanor discovered that the nexus is tied to a sacred site, a place called the Hollow Grove. It's where the original pact was forged centuries ago. She attempted to destroy it, but failed. Amy's heart sank. Why didn't she tell anyone? Why keep this a secret? Because she knew the cost, Elias replied softly. Destroying the nexus requires a life, a willing sacrifice. Eleanor couldn't bring herself to pay that price, so she sealed the grove instead, hoping it would remain hidden forever. Amy stared at him, her stomach churning. And now Moros has grown strong enough to break through her seal, Elias nodded, which means we're running out of time. The Hollow Grove was located deep within an ancient forest, miles away from civilization. According to legend, it was a place where the veil between worlds was thinnest, a gateway to realms beyond human comprehension. As Amy, Daniel, and a small team of Veil Keepers approached the grove, they could feel its oppressive energy long before reaching it. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. A thick mist clung to the ground, muffling their footsteps and distorting sound. At the center of the grove stood a massive stone monolith, etched with the same symbols Amy had seen in Seabrook and Chicago. This is it, Elias whispered, his voice trembling with awe. The heart of the pact. Amy stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching for the crimson journal. But as she drew closer to the monolith, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Images flashed in her mind, her great-grandfather kneeling before the altar, her grandmother sealing the grove, and finally her own face reflected in the obsidian surface. A voice echoed in her head, low and menacing. You cannot undo what has been done. She stumbled back, gasping for air. Daniel caught her, steadying her as the others prepared for whatever might come next. As the team worked to decipher the monolith's inscriptions, Amy wandered to the edge of the grove, seeking clarity. That's when she found it, a hidden compartment beneath a moss-covered rock. Inside was a leather-bound diary belonging to her grandmother. Trembling, Amy opened the journal and began reading. The entries revealed a side of Eleanor she'd never known, a woman torn between duty and love, fear and hope. One passage stood out. I thought I could protect my family by sealing the grove, but I was wrong. The circle feeds on our suffering, growing stronger with each generation. If anyone finds this, know that breaking the pact will require more than courage. It will demand everything. Amy's eyes filled with tears as she realized the truth. Her grandmother hadn't failed because she lacked strength. She had chosen to spare her descendants the burden of sacrifice. Now that burden rested squarely on Amy's shoulders. When Amy returned to the group, her resolve was clear. I know how to destroy the Nexus, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. But it comes at a cost. Someone has to stay behind, to anchor the ritual and ensure the circle is broken. Daniel's face paled. There has to be another way. There isn't, Amy replied firmly. If I don't do this, Moros and the others will continue spreading despair. They'll consume everything, and everyone we care about. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder. Are you sure about this? Once you commit, there's no turning back. Amy nodded, clutching the crimson journal tightly. I'm sure. This is why I was brought here, to finish what my grandmother started. The team prepared the ritual under Amy's guidance, using information from both the Crimson Journal and Eleanor's diary. They formed a protective circle around the monolith, chanting incantations to weaken the Nexus's defenses. Shadows writhed and twisted, resisting their efforts, but Amy refused to falter. As the final step approached, Daniel pulled her aside. You don't have to do this alone, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Let me stay with you. Amy shook her head, smiling sadly. This is my fight, Daniel. My family's curse. It's up to me to end it. With tears streaming down her face, she stepped into the center of the circle and began the incantation. Golden light erupted from the journal, engulfing the grove in a blinding glow. The monolith cracked, releasing a deafening roar as centuries of dark magic unraveled. One by one, the members of the Obsidian Circle were banished, their forms dissolving into nothingness. But as the light faded, Amy remained, her body glowing faintly as she anchored the ritual. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But this is where my story ends." The hollow grove was silent now, its oppressive energy replaced by an eerie stillness. The monolith lay shattered, its dark magic extinguished. Golden light lingered faintly in the air, a testament to the ritual that had ended the obsidian circle's reign of terror. Daniel knelt beside the spot where Amy had stood, his hands trembling as he touched the ground. Tears streamed down his face, but he didn't try to wipe them away. He had known Amy for only a short time, but her courage and determination had left an indelible mark on him and on the world. Elias approached quietly, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "She saved us all," he said softly. "Her sacrifice will never be forgotten." Daniel nodded, though the weight of loss pressed heavily on his chest. "But at what cost? She gave everything, and we couldn't stop her." Elias sighed, his expression somber. "Sometimes the greatest heroes are those who walk alone." Amy understood that better than anyone. Back at the Veil Keeper's headquarters, the mood was subdued. News of Amy's sacrifice spread quickly among the members, and while many mourned her loss, they also celebrated her bravery. To honor her memory, Elias proposed naming a new division of the Veil Keepers after her, the Carter Initiative, dedicated to protecting bloodlines tainted by supernatural curses. "She taught us that hope can overcome despair," Elias said during a memorial gathering, "and that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to choose light over shadow." Daniel listened silently, his mind replaying every moment he'd shared with Amy. From their first meeting in the catacombs beneath Blackthorn's house to their final goodbye in the Hollow Grove, she had shown him what it meant to truly fight, not just for survival, but for something greater. After the ceremony, Daniel retreated to the library, where Amy's crimson journal sat on a pedestal. Its golden runes no longer glowed, but the pages remained intact, filled with knowledge she had risked everything to preserve. He opened it carefully, tracing the words she had written during her journey. At the very end, he found a note addressed to him. "Daniel, if you're reading this, then I've done what needed to be done. Don't grieve for me. I made my choice willingly. Take care of yourself and keep fighting. The world needs people like you. With gratitude, Amy." Tears blurred his vision as he closed the journal. For the first time since losing her, he felt a flicker of peace. Amy's legacy wasn't just in the lives she had saved, it was in the hope she had inspired. Weeks passed, and life within the Veil Keepers slowly returned to normal. Or as normal as it could be for an organization dedicated to battling supernatural threats. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Reports began trickling in from across the globe. Strange disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and sightings of creatures unlike anything they'd encountered before. One night while reviewing these reports, Daniel stumbled upon a chilling detail. In each location affected by the disturbances, witnesses described hearing a single phrase whispered in the darkness. "The circle may be broken, but the void remains." He brought the information to Elias, who studied the data with growing concern. "This isn't random," Elias said finally. "Something, or someone, is testing us. It knows about Amy's sacrifice and the destruction of the Obsidian Circle." "But who?" Daniel asked. "Who would dare challenge us after what we faced?" Elias hesitated before answering. "There are forces older than the Obsidian Circle, entities that predate recorded history. If one of them has awakened..." He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Whatever this new threat was, it was far beyond anything they had encountered before. The disturbances escalated rapidly. Entire villages were abandoned overnight, their inhabitants vanishing without a trace. Those who remained spoke of a creeping darkness, a living shadow that consumed everything in its path. It seemed to target places tied to ancient rituals or sacred sites, feeding on residual energy left behind by past conflicts. Daniel led a team to investigate one such site, an abandoned temple in the mountains of Nepal. The air grew colder the closer they got, and the ground was littered with fragments of obsidian, the same material used in the original pact. Inside the temple, they found carvings depicting a figure cloaked in swirling shadows, its form shifting between human and monstrous. Beneath the image were symbols none of them recognized, pulsating faintly with an otherworldly glow. "This isn't part of the obsidian circle," Elias murmured, his voice tinged with dread. "This is something else entirely." Before they could decipher the symbols, the shadows around them came alive, coalescing into a towering entity. Its voice reverberated through the chamber, deep and guttural. "You think yourselves victorious? You have merely scratched the surface of eternity?" Daniel stepped forward, clutching a protective talisman. "Who are you?" The entity tilted its head, studying him with glowing eyes. "I am the void, and I hunger." As the entity lunged toward them, Daniel and his team fought back with everything they had: incantations, enchanted weapons, and sheer determination. But the void was unlike anything they'd faced before. It absorbed their attacks, growing stronger with each attempt to harm it. Just when all hope seemed lost, a faint golden light appeared in the corner of the chamber. It grew brighter, taking the shape of a familiar figure. Amy. Her form was translucent, her expression calm but resolute. "You're not alone," she said, her voice echoing softly. "I'll always be with you." The light surged forward, striking the void and forcing it to retreat. For a moment, the chamber was bathed in warmth, and the oppressive energy dissipated. When the light faded, Amy was gone, but her presence lingered, a reminder that her sacrifice had not been in vain. Back at the Veil Keeper's headquarters, Daniel recounted the events in the Nepalese temple to Elias and the rest of the team. Though shaken by their encounter with the void, they couldn't deny the significance of Amy's intervention. Her spectral appearance had not only saved them, but also hinted at a deeper connection between her sacrifice and the emerging threat. "She's still here," Daniel said, his voice tinged with awe. "Her spirit, or whatever remains of it, is tied to the ritual she performed." "Maybe that's why the void retreated," Elias nodded thoughtfully. "It's possible. The ritual broke the nexus, but it may have created a new anchor point, a bridge between our world and something else." He opened Amy's crimson journal, flipping to the final pages. There, faint traces of golden ink shimmered faintly, forming words that hadn't been there before. "The circle is broken, but the void feeds on what remains. To defeat it, you must seek the first pact." "The first pact?" Daniel repeated, frowning. "What does that mean?" Elias sighed, rubbing his temples. "If I'm right, the first pact predates the Obsidian Circle. It's the original binding, a contract forged between humanity and entities like the void. Breaking it won't be easy. It might even require another sacrifice." Daniel clenched his fists, anger and frustration boiling within him. "We've already lost too much. How many more people have to die before this ends?" Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. "Amy gave us a fighting chance. Now it's up to us to honor her memory by finishing what she started." The Veil Keepers launched an intensive investigation into the First Pact, scouring ancient texts, forgotten archives, and cryptic artifacts for any mention of its origins. What they discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. According to legend, the First Pact was made during a time when humanity first began exploring the boundaries of magic and spirituality. Desperate for power, knowledge, or protection, early civilizations summoned entities from beyond the veil, offering pieces of their souls in exchange for favors. Over time, these pacts multiplied, creating a web of interconnected curses and bindings that spanned generations. One document, written in a language so old it required translation by multiple experts, described the First Pact as the seed of all shadows. It warned that breaking it would unleash chaos, but failing to do so would allow the void to consume everything. "We need to find the location of the First Pact," Daniel declared during a strategy meeting. "If we can destroy it, maybe we can stop the void once and for all." Elias hesitated. Destroying the First Pact won't just affect the void. It could unravel every supernatural bond in existence, including those we rely on to fight these threats. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Destroying the First Pact wasn't just risky, it was potentially catastrophic. As tensions mounted within the Veil Keepers, Daniel sought guidance from an unexpected source: Lila, Amy's ghostly great-aunt. Though her form flickered weakly, she agreed to meet him in the hidden sanctuary where Amy had first encountered her. You're asking me about the first pact, Lila said, her voice soft but steady. Few know of its existence, and fewer still understand its true nature. But yes, I can tell you this. It lies at the heart of the Shadow Realm, a place between worlds where time and space hold no meaning. How do we get there? Daniel asked urgently. Lila shook her head. Entering the Shadow Realm requires a guide, and not just any guide. You'll need someone who has walked its paths before. Her gaze shifted to the crimson journal lying on the table. Amy knew this. That's why she left behind fragments of her essence. She intended to lead you there herself. Daniel stared at the journal, realization dawning. Amy hadn't just sacrificed herself to break the Nexus. She had prepared for the battles to come, ensuring her legacy would endure. Using the Crimson Journal as a conduit, Daniel and a small team of Veil Keepers performed a ritual to open a portal to the Shadow Realm. Golden light erupted from the journal's pages, swirling into a vortex that pulsed with energy. As they stepped through, they found themselves in a surreal landscape, endless plains of shifting darkness, dotted with glowing orbs that seemed to hum with ancient power. This place, one of the team members whispered, her voice trembling. It feels alive. It is alive, Daniel replied grimly. Every shadow, every orb, it's a fragment of someone's soul, bound by the first pact. Guided by Amy's lingering presence, they navigated the treacherous terrain, avoiding traps and illusions designed to disorient intruders. Along the way, they encountered echoes of past victims, people who had been consumed by the void or trapped in the Shadow Realm after failed attempts to break the pact. Finally, they reached the heart of the realm, a massive obsidian obelisk etched with runes that glowed faintly. At its base stood a figure cloaked in shadows, the embodiment of the void. "You dare trespass here?" the entity growled, its voice reverberating through the air. "You cannot undo what has been woven." Daniel stepped forward, clutching the Crimson Journal. "We're not here to negotiate. We're here to end this." The battle that followed was unlike anything the Veil Keepers had ever faced. The void unleashed waves of shadowy tendrils, each one capable of draining their life force. But Amy's essence guided them, shielding them from harm and weakening the entity's defenses. As the others fought, Daniel approached the obelisk, reciting an incantation from the journal. The runes flared brightly, cracking the surface of the monolith. The void roared in fury, lashing out with renewed strength. "You can't win," Daniel shouted, his voice filled with determination. "We've faced worse than you." With a final surge of energy, he drove the journal into the obelisk, shattering it completely. A blinding flash of light engulfed the realm, dissolving the void and severing the first pact. When the light faded, Daniel and his team found themselves back in the real world, surrounded by the ruins of the Nepalese temple. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. But as Daniel looked down at the Crimson Journal, now reduced to ash, he felt a pang of sorrow. Amy's essence had vanished, her final act of bravery sealing her fate forever. "She gave us a future," Elias said softly, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "And now it's up to us to protect it." Though Amy was gone, her legacy lived on, not just in the lives she had saved, but in the hope she had inspired. The Veil Keepers continued their mission, honoring her memory by standing against the darkness. In the years that followed, stories of Amy Carter spread among those who knew of the Veil Keepers. She became a symbol of courage and selflessness, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person could make a difference. And somewhere, in the quiet moments between battles, Daniel would hear her voice, a whisper carried on the wind, urging him to keep fighting, because the world always needed heroes. If you enjoyed this epic tale of mystery, suspense, and supernatural battles, don't miss out on more thrilling adventures. Subscribe to our channel for exclusive access to new stories, character deep dives, and behind-the-scenes content. Whether you're here for the chills, the action, or the unforgettable characters like Amy Carter, we promise to keep you hooked until the very end. Hit that subscribe button now and join us on this journey into the unknown. Who knows? The next hero might be waiting just around the corner.